Today I'm filming from Torquay Cemetery, where I'm at the grave here with the flowers of my great-great-grandfather on my mother's side. And we're going to conclude our talk about the second half of chapter 15 of 1 Corinthians. And in this final section, Paul now comments on the actual nature of the resurrection event. Paul asks what any Greco-Roman would ask: how are the dead raised? It's a reasonable question. Everyone knows that dead bodies decay, and we are surrounded, as we are in this cemetery, by bodies that have been buried. But Paul isn't so easily put off. Resurrection is not resuscitation, but rebirth. Using the analogy of a seed, Paul argues that there is both continuity and discontinuity with the former life. Verse 34 ends with Paul saying that all of these things, the way that they have thought about this, is to their shame. Now he calls them stupid fools or ignoramuses and uses words and slurs like this. The Greek culture, though, would have been used to a slur like this, because public speakers that they so clamoured for would often respond to people who shouted out with responses like, "You fool! Silence, you ignoramus!" So in taking the metaphor of a seed, Paul now shows that there is no way that you could know that what you plant into the ground would grow into what it becomes. You couldn't tell what it could grow into. But one thing is certain: it is certainly very different. It is certainly more glorious. It reminds me of the scene in Star Wars when Obi-Wan Kenobi says to Darth Vader, "If you strike me down, I will become more powerful than you can imagine." Paul could say, when we are struck down, we will become more glorious than you can imagine. Mortal life is marked by the absence of glory. It's marked by temporal weakness and limitations. The resurrection body, though, displays this glory, the power of the spiritual quality of the supernatural. The acorn is nothing like the mighty oak. Paul is essentially saying to the Corinthians, resurrection is transformation, not mere resuscitation. It's a bit better than the transformation scene in Beauty and the Beast, where the beast is lifted up and transfigured into the prince. Now, driving towards a conclusion, Paul outlines a mystery and names the victory. He says this transformation through resurrection is not incidental, but it's necessary. In verse 50, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. He says the dead will rise, but the living will be transformed in a split second. For verse 54, in the third part, part C, Paul concludes by drawing once again on Isaiah 25, verses 7 to 8. The Lord will swallow up death forever. And verse 55, he draws on Hosea 13, verse 14. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? Using the Old Testament idea that though God judge his people, even though they die, yet God alone can bring them back. This is precisely the point in Ezekiel's vision of the dry bones, and in several other places where God does the impossible. So Paul ends now, not by referring to the Corinthians as fools or ignoramuses or stupid, but he now calls them in verse 58 brothers and sisters, beloved brothers and sisters. He's basically saying, look, if all this is true, if everything I've said is true, I encourage you to stand firm, to remain unmoved, to give every drop of energy to gospel work and gospel living. Because if it is true, none of this is in vain. If it's true, we of all people can never be pitied, all because God's grace towards us is not in vain, as he says in verse 10.